The ballroom at Aurelia Grand smelled like money. Champagne, imported orchids, suits that cost more than Stephen Vance made in 4 months. He almost didn't make it tonight. The babysitter canceled at the last minute. No warning, no backup. He stood in his kitchen with a dead phone line and a 7-year-old watching him from the couch, already reading his face. He knocked on the manager's door and said the words that cost him something. "She won't move. She won't make a sound. I just can't leave her alone." A long pause. A sigh. "Keep her invisible. This isn't a place for kids." Now Chloe sat behind the coat check, cross-legged, paperback open, tucked into a shadow no one bothered to notice. She had learned, too early, how to take up very little space. Before his shift, she pressed a paper crane into his breast pocket. "As long as the crane stays safe, you stay safe, Daddy." Davis Jackson had a way of entering a room that made other people feel they had been standing in the wrong place. Guest of honor. Name on the donor wall. 3rd line, largest font. He moved through the ballroom the way men move, when they have never once considered that someone might not step aside. Not arrogance exactly. Something quieter and more permanent than that. The simple, unexamined certainty that the world arranged itself around people like him, and that everything else, the staff, the uniforms, the men standing at posts, were furniture with a function. He didn't look at Stephen when he reached into his jacket. He didn't even look. He pulled out a folded bill and dropped it on the marble floor in front of Stephen's shoes, the casual, unhurried gesture of a man feeding something beneath him. "Pick it up," he said. "That's what you're worth tonight." The room went still. Not shocked. Interested. Stephen didn't move. Didn't look at the money. He looked past all of it, to the coat check corner where small hands were clutching a paper crane so tightly her knuckles had gone white. He didn't bend down. What Davis Jackson didn't know, what no one in that gleaming room knew, was that a figure had been watching him all evening from the shadows. Still. Patient. The kind of still that only comes from years of waiting for exactly the right moment. Earlier that evening, before the doors opened and the money walked in, there had still been time. Not much, but some. The ballroom hummed with last-minute choreography. Napkins refolded, glasses repositioned, a sommelier arguing quietly with a caterer near the east wall. Stephen stood at the edge of it, watching none of it. His eyes moved through the room, the ceiling joints, the gap between the service door and its frame, the 2 cameras covering the main floor. It was habit so old it had stopped feeling like a choice. He just did it, the way other men check their phones. He sat beside Chloe for a few minutes. Just that. The bench behind the coat check, the 2 of them close enough that he could feel the warmth off her shoulder. She finished her sentence before looking up. He had taught her that, without meaning to. "Daddy." Her eyes stayed on the page. "Why do you always look at the corners of rooms?" He glanced around the lobby. High ceilings. 4 entry points. The service corridor running blind behind the west wall. "Old habit," he said. She looked up then. "From before?" He nodded once. Didn't add anything. She accepted that the way she accepted most things, quietly, filing it somewhere he couldn't see. She had a whole archive of things like that. Things he'd said, or half said, things she'd noticed and stored, waiting for the day she'd have the words to ask about them properly. He knew this about her. It was one of the things that kept him awake sometimes, in the good way. She went back to the crane she'd been folding from the inside cover of her book. Her fingers worked without looking. The precise, unhurried movements of a child who had done this enough times that her hands knew the way. When it was done, she held it out on her palm. "I like that you notice things other people don't," she said. Stephen held it for a moment, looked at it. Then he tucked this one beside the first, two cranes together in his breast pocket, and stood. From across the lobby, the main doors opened. A wedge of cold air. The sound of car doors and heels on marble. He adjusted his jacket. Chloe was already opening her book again, but as he walked to his post, he felt her watching him. Not worried, just watching, the way she always did. Like she was memorizing him for later, building a version of him she could carry when he wasn't there. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The incident with Davis happened at 9:05 p.m. A man in a charcoal blazer tried to walk past the restricted corridor. Stephen stepped forward, said the words he was trained to say. The man turned slowly. The particular, unhurried turn of someone for whom being inconvenienced by other people is a recurring disappointment. "You're just a guard," he said. "Know your place." Then Davis Jackson, guest of honor, name on the donor wall, the kind of man whose name preceded him into every room, reached into his jacket, pulled out a folded bill, and dropped it on the marble floor in front of Stephen's shoes. "Pick it up," he said. "That's your worth tonight." The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when they want to watch. Not shocked quiet, entertained quiet. The particular stillness of people who are grateful the thing is happening to someone else. Stephen didn't move. He didn't look at the bill. He didn't look at Cho. He looked at the coat check corner, where a 7-year-old girl had stopped reading and was holding a paper crane so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Inside his chest, something pulled in two directions at once. The part of him that had spent 6 years learning to hold very still under pressure, held. The other part, the part that had been awake since 6 a.m. making school lunches and signing permission slips and being a father, looked at his daughter's face and felt the weight of what she was seeing and what she would carry from it. He made a choice. He stood still. He said nothing. Not because he was diminished, because she was watching. Because sometimes the truest form of strength is the kind that doesn't perform itself. The room smoothed over, the way expensive rooms always do, quickly, without friction, and the laughter resumed, and the glasses clinked, and Stephen returned to his circuit. He let his eyes do the work. The east corridor was his first pass. Unhurried, neutral expression, hands loose at his sides. The camera at the VIP hallway junction was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. 15 degrees off-center. He crouched, just briefly, adjusting his shoe, and looked at the base screw. New threading marks. Not wear. Someone had loosened it deliberately, rotated the angle, retightened with care. The dead zone it created was not random. It covered the service exit on the far side of the VIP corridor completely. An arc of invisibility, precisely positioned. He stood, kept walking. Near the kitchen annex, two men in hotel uniforms pushed through the swinging door into the secondary kitchen. White shirts, black trousers, but no lanyards. No ID badges clipped anywhere. He watched their gait as the door swung shut behind them. Not the careful, slightly rushed walk of catering staff mid-service. Something steadier, purposeful in the wrong direction. Something that didn't look at the food. Stephen noted the time, 9:15 p.m. The third thing happened near the main bar. Davis Jackson was holding a conversation with two men in Italian suits when his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. The change in his face lasted less than a second. Not alarm, not pleasure, something in between, something with an edge. And then he killed the screen and slid the phone away in one practice motion. Before he resumed speaking, he scanned the room. Not the quick social glance of someone checking for a waiter. A sweet bad eye. Methodical. Starting left, ending at the service corridor. An old reflex, Stephen thought. The kind you develop in rooms where being caught looking costs you something. He had spent 6 years reading exactly that tell. Internal investigator, private security firm, not the uniformed kind, the invisible kind. Corporate fraud. Money laundering through event budgets and vendor invoices and charity galas exactly like this one. He had sat in rooms like this and watched men like Davis Jackson and known, with the specific certainty of someone who has followed the paperwork, exactly what was moving through the walls. He'd left it the March after Elena died. Chloe was 4. She needed a father who came home on schedule, who sat at the kitchen table in the morning, who was present in all the ordinary ways that turn out to matter more than anyone tells you they will. The hotel job was supposed to be temporary, something to cover the rent while he figured out the next thing. That was 3 years ago. He told himself it was temporary less often now. He came back through the lobby and found Chloe. Sometime during his circuit she had moved from the coat check bench, drifted down the hallway near the freight elevator, drawn by better light or fewer feet, and settled herself on the floor there with her book in her lap and a fresh sheet of paper in her hands. She hadn't asked permission. She never needed to. She knew how to find the right corner. She didn't notice him notice. She was folding. He came and stood beside her. She looked up. "Daddy." A small gesture toward the bar. "That lady's been watching the door the whole time. Not the people, just the door." He looked. A woman, alone at the far end of the bar. A glass of something amber she hadn't touched in the 20 minutes he'd been watching the room. Her left hand rested near the opening of her bag. Not inside it, just near, the way a person keeps a hand near something they may need quickly. Back against the wall. Chair angled outward, giving her sightlines across the entire lobby. She had positioned herself to see everything and be seen from almost nothing. Stephen recognized the geometry of it with the same wordless certainty with which he recognized the camera angle and the gait of the men in the kitchen. He had sat in that exact position himself, in other rooms, in other years. He didn't say anything to Chloe. He ruffled her hair once, lightly, and let his eyes move back to the room. Raymond Chu's office was barely a room, a converted storage space beside the reception desk, used mostly as a place to have conversations that couldn't happen in the open. The door was always open, except when it wasn't. Raymond held it and didn't quite close it. That was deliberate. A reminder that this was still a professional conversation, that nothing being said here was anything other than reasonable management. "Mr. Vance had to talk." His voice had the quality that hotel managers' voices develop over years of navigating money, calibrated, warm at the surface, something much harder underneath. "Tonight's guests, you understand who they are." "I understand what my post is," Stephen said. "Your post is to be invisible, not to enforce policy with people who paid more for this evening than you'll make this calendar year." He paused, adjusted his cufflink. A small, precise movement, the gesture of a man who thinks in margins. What happened earlier, that kind of friction doesn't serve anyone. Someone tried to enter a restricted corridor, and it was handled. Raymond's voice dropped a register. He turned to look through the narrow office window. The lobby, the coat check bench, empty now because Chloe had moved. "You have your daughter out there somewhere." He let that sit. "Think about stability," he said. "For her sake." It was not advice. Stephen recognized it for exactly what it was, the same way he recognized a rotated camera and a rehearsed room sweep. A threat that had been dressed in the language of concern because that was safer, because it gave the person making it plausible deniability, because it was the kind of thing that worked on people who had something to lose. He had something to lose. He stood very still for a moment. Through the glass he could see the hallway where Chloe had resettled. She had her book open, one knee tucked up, her whole body arranged with the complete absorption of a child who has found a world she likes better than this one. She didn't know he was watching. She didn't know this conversation was happening. She was just reading, in the quiet corner she'd chosen, folding paper on the side. Something moved through Stephen's chest. Not quite fear, not quite anger. Something older than both. He held it there, felt it settle. He nodded once. Raymond smiled. Brief, satisfied, the smile of a man who has correctly assessed the situation. Stephen walked out. He went directly to the far end of the bar. Not for a drink. He stopped 2 stools down from the woman with the amber glass and faced forward, like a man taking a moment to survey the room. He didn't look at her when he spoke. West corridor camera has been manually rotated, he said, his voice underneath the music. Creates a blind spot over the VIP service exit. 2 men went into the secondary kitchen at 9:15. No ID badges, walk was wrong. And the event host killed a text message at 9:47 and swept the room before he put his phone away. A pause. He let it sit. The woman picked up her glass, set it down without drinking. You're observant, she said, for a guard. I'm not just a guard. She didn't respond, didn't look at him, but the angle of her shoulders shifted, barely, the way a person shifts when they've decided something. And then, deliberate and unhurried, she adjusted her bag on the stool beside her. The lining caught the bar light at an angle, just for a moment. The grip of a compact sidearm in an inside holster. A metal card clipped flat against the inner frame. Matte finish. No logo. She could have kept it hidden. She didn't. She's showing me, Stephen thought. On purpose. She's deciding whether to trust me, and she's doing it out loud. He looked straight ahead. He understood the gesture. He let her make it in her own time. The main entrance opened again at 9:52 p.m. on. Not with the sound of individuals arriving. With the sound of an entourage, the particular shift in ambient noise and attention that happens when money enters a room that is already full of money and still notices. Davis Jackson crossed the lobby in 3 strides. His expression had changed completely from the one he wore for crowd performances and small humiliations. This was a man greeting something he had been working toward. Something real. The man he embraced at the door was broad-shouldered, white-haired, a handshake he let everyone nearby see. Davis introduced him as Viktor Senn. Investor was the word that moved through the room. Polite, deliberately vague, the kind of word used when the specific truth is less convenient. Stephen's jaw tightened. He knew that face. Not from a police database. He had never had access to those, had never been that kind of investigator. He knew it from a file he had read under fluorescent lights in a conference room in Geneva, 3 years before Elena got sick, during a case that had eventually stalled because the man at the center of it was careful in the specific way that people become careful when they have very good legal counsel, and a long practice of remaining 1 step removed from every probable fact. A holding company with no employees and 14 subsidiaries. 3 insurance claims that didn't match 3 incident reports. The name time in the ownership chain twice, always at a remove, always behind someone else's signature, always insulated by exactly 1 more layer than was comfortable to prosecute. Never enough, always enough to recognize. Viktor Senn shook Davis Jackson's hand like a man sealing something that had already been decided in a different room. Stephen looked at a fixed point on the wall and let the information settle into the part of him that had been built to hold things without showing them. His face didn't change. His breathing didn't change. But inside, something that had been dormant for 3 years shifted and was awake. From across the room, Davis looked back at him. Not at Viktor. Not at the crowd. At Stephen. The look lasted less than 3 seconds. Then Davis turned away and resumed his conversation. But within a minute, unhurried, natural-looking, a man in hotel uniform had repositioned himself near the corridor entrance. He wasn't watching Chloe. He was watching the bar. The space Stephen had been standing in. The surveillance had started. They were being careful about it. That told Stephen something too. Chloe appeared at his elbow with a glass of water. She held it up without preamble. "You look like you do when you're thinking really hard, Daddy." He took the water. "Just doing my job, sweetheart." She nodded, satisfied, and turned back toward her spot in the hallway. But his eyes had already moved, to Viktor Senn disappearing into the VIP corridor, to the uniformed man, then briefly, carefully, to the woman at the bar, who was looking in the same direction as Stephen without appearing to do so. They hadn't exchanged another word since the bar. They were watching the same door. At his breast pocket, through the fabric of his jacket, Stephen felt the small folded weight of 2 cranes. He pressed his hand flat against them. Just for a second. Just wrong enough to feel the paper, the little angles of Chloe's folding. Then he looked back up. The night had barely started. By 10:30 p.m., the event had reached the hour when expensive parties begin to believe their own mythology. Louder. Loser darty of mine. The careful performance of the early evening, dissolving into something that felt, to those inside it, like freedom. The room had relaxed into itself. Nobody was watching the edges anymore. That was the problem. Stephen saw it before he understood it. A woman moving through the lobby, not quickly, not slowly. The careful pace of someone who has been told to look normal and is concentrating too hard on exactly that. Mid-30s. Press lanyard. Small recorder bag over one shoulder, held slightly too close to her body. He'd clocked her earlier, around 9 o'clock. She'd been working the room with a notebook, the particular focused alertness of a journalist looking for the thread of a story. She had the bearing of someone who was used to being the observer in the room, not the observed. Now that alertness had collapsed inward, her eyes were doing what eyes do when a person is running calculations and not finding good answers. Her hands were clasped at her waist, not folded, clasped. Fingers locked over fingers, the way a person holds themselves together when they are afraid and cannot show it. 2 men flanked her, the same men Stephen had watched walk into the secondary kitchen at 9:15. White shirts. No badges. Raymond appeared from the reception corridor. He smiled. Warm, professional, the full performance. "It's been arranged, Ms. Lamb," he said. "This way." She went. Because the man with the title and the smile had confirmed it was fine. Because that is how it works. The machinery of authority doesn't need force when it has presentation. "Daddy." Chloe was beside him. He hadn't heard her move. She held her own hands out in front of her, fingers pressed lightly together, showing him the shape. "That lady doesn't want to go. Her hands are like this the whole time." Stephen looked. The VIP corridor door swung shut. Something in his chest pulled tight. He moved toward the door, and Davis Jackson was there. 3 steps in and suddenly there, the way large men sometimes materialize when they have been waiting. 2 others behind him. "Staff only, Vance." A guest just entered an unsecured corridor without proper security escort. "She was escorted by my people." They stood there. The door was 6 feet away. Stephen had no authority to open it, and Davis knew exactly that. The stillness at the corner of his mouth said he had known it before he came over. Then Celine was beside them, holding her glass, tilting her head toward the corridor, the expression of someone mildly bothered by the noise from an adjacent room. Davis turned, drawn by the social obligation of attending to a VIP's complaint. Half a step of distraction. Celine was close enough that Stephen felt the words more than heard them. "I need 3 more minutes. Don't break the door." He looked straight ahead. Clock's running. He watched her manage Davis. The small complaint, the polite misdirection, the practiced social machinery of someone who had done this in harder rooms than this one. And while she talked, her bag shifted. The same angle as before, the same deliberate carelessness. Not an accident. She was reminding him of what he'd already seen, giving him something to stand on. He crossed to her side, slow enough to look purposeless. You said 3 minutes, 90 seconds in. I need the server room signal, she said, not looking at him. Basement 1. Terry Noon killed the backup feed at 9:47. Server room is bone, right at the freight elevator. I have access. A beat. Davis has had someone on me since 10:15. 1 second. 2. Why are you helping me? She said. Before you know who I am. The room hummed around them. Somewhere behind them, a woman laughed too loudly at something that probably wasn't funny. The ordinary sounds of people performing a good evening. Because someone just walked through that door who didn't want to, Stephen said. That's enough. She was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone who has been trained to account for every variable and has just encountered one that wasn't in the manual. Then, the hotel's main network is down. Terry took it offline. Server room has an independent port, separate frequency, doesn't route through the hotel system. He kept his voice level. I checked the building infrastructure my first week, old habit. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something that had been wary becoming, very slightly, something else. They needed to move. The freight elevator was 40 feet away, through a service corridor that had acquired, in the last 10 minutes, one new occupant, a man in hotel uniform, standing very still and looking at nothing with great concentration. They stopped. Celine assessed the corridor. Stephen assessed the man. A standoff without motion. Then, Chloe was there. The quiet materialization she had perfected over years of existing in adult spaces that didn't entirely account for her. She had a third crane in her hand, folded from a page torn carefully from the back of her book. She held it toward Stephen, but she was already talking. Daddy, the man with the blue vest. The conversational tone she used for everything, as though this were no more urgent than a report on what she'd read. He stood right under the camera, the one that's turned wrong, and he looked up at it. Then he went really fast into the small room next to the elevator. She held up the crane as evidence of her location. I was sitting right there, folding. He didn't look at me. Stephen went still. Blue vest. What did he look like? She described him the way children describe things before they learn to filter. Cleanly, specifically, without the editorializing that adults add when they're uncertain. Short hair, metal frame glasses, shoes with brown soles, when everything else was black. Celine's hand was already at her bag. What time? Stephen asked. Chloe thought about it. The clock in the hall said 9:45. I remember because I counted the numbers. I do that sometimes. 9:45 p.m. The backup feed went dark at 9:47. Terry Noon had been standing under the compromised camera, the one he had adjusted, 2 minutes before the signal dropped, confirming his work, making sure, why? And no one had looked at him, because no one looks at what a 7-year-old in a hallway sees. Celine took out a device no larger than a phone, pressed a sequence. The indicator shifted from amber to green, and something in her posture changed. A very small release, the easing of a person who has been holding tension in their shoulders for longer than they realize. She looked at Chloe for a long moment, the evaluating look of someone whose entire profession is built on the reliability of sources. You're a very good observer, she said. Chloe considered this with the seriousness she brought to most compliments, weighing it, deciding whether it was true rather than just kind. Daddy taught me, she said. He says, corners matter. Celine looked at Stephen. Something in her expression had changed, the last professional layer gone, replaced by something simpler that didn't have a job title. "I have enough," she said quietly. "Name, time, location, physical description, independent witness. The warrant cleared 2 minutes ago." She glanced at the device. 4 minutes. Stephen looked at the man in the corridor. The man was looking back. Davis Jackson received the message at 10:38 p.m. Stephen saw it happen from 30 feet away. The forward lean, the small recalibration of the shoulders. Some things you learn to read before the body commits to the action. He had spent years learning exactly this. Davis put his phone away, started walking. 2 men at his sides, the room thinning around him. Not noticeably, not dramatically, but the way rooms thin when something is about to happen, and the people who are paying attention have already begun to create space. He stopped 6 feet from Stephen. He had the particular expression of a man who has calculated the cost of the next thing and decided it's acceptable. "We're going to need you to step outside, Vance. Procedural matter." Stephen said, "How long?" Behind him, barely. 4 minutes. "Okay," he said. Calmly, like a man agreeing to something entirely reasonable. Then he looked at Davis Starchwall. "You want me to go? Come walk me out yourself." The first man moved. Fast-eyed. Stephen was not faster, but he was earlier, which is different. He didn't step back. He stepped left, took the man's wrist with both hands, let the momentum continue past him, and redirected it into the wall. Controlled. No excess. The man slid to one knee. Still conscious, wrist locked at an angle that communicated with great clarity that further movement would be a poor decision. 4 seconds. The second man came from the right, angling for behind. Stephen released the first, pivoted, used the full rotation, brought his forearm across the man's reach, stepped inside his guard, applied pressure to the shoulder joint. Not a strike. A direction. A clear and specific instruction delivered through force that the body accepts more readily than the mind. The man went to the floor the way bodies go when they've been given a better option than standing. 6 seconds. Davis came in fast and angry. Those two things together, Stephen had learned, produced a predictable geometry. He let the distance close, stepped into the swing instead of away, absorbed the angle on his shoulder, used the forward momentum. Hip rotation, one arm under, one over. Davis hit the floor with his hands behind his back before the room had fully processed the sound of it. Stephen held the position. One knee. Davis' wrists locked behind him. He was not breathing hard. He was not angry. His face was quiet. The focused stillness of someone who has done a thing they were trained to do and done it correctly, and feels nothing about it except the simple fact of completion. No performance. No satisfaction. Just the plain economy of a body that remembered everything even after the years of telling it to forget. 11 seconds. The lobby went silent. Chloe stood at the edge of the hallway. Both hands pressed flat against the third crane, holding it against her chest. She was looking at her father. Not the way she had looked when Davis dropped the money. That look had been something breaking open. Something she didn't have language for. The first terrible split between the father she knew in the ordinary world and the version the room was trying to make of him. She had looked at him then, and something in her face had clenched, and he had seen it, and it had cost him something he didn't have a name for. This was different. This was the split closing. She was looking at him the way she looked at things she recognized. Not the uniform. Not the situation. Him. Why? The man who checked the corners of rooms out of old habit. The man who noticed the camera and the gate and the message on a phone screen. The man who had stood completely still when it would have been easier to move, and moved completely decisively when it would have been easier to stay still. She knew him. She had always known him. Celine stepped forward. The badge came up, not dramatic, not performative, just clear. Financial Crimes Enforcement. Nobody moves. 3 seconds of nothing. Then the main doors opened on all sides simultaneously. 12 people in plain clothes, the specific purposeful entry of a team that has rehearsed the spacing of this. No shouting. No drawn weapons. Just controlled presence filling the lobby the way water fills a space. Evenly, completely, finding every corner. Viktor Senn came out of the VIP corridor between 2 officers. Hands cuffed. He looked diminished, the breadth of his shoulders unchanged, but something essential gone from him. The quality that had made the room rearrange itself 2 hours ago, simply absent. What remained was just a man, aging, in an expensive jacket. Sophia Lamb came out behind him. She stopped when she saw Stephen Tristy. Her face was still pale, a faint tremor in her jaw that she was working to control, the specific effort of someone reassembling their composure from the inside out. She looked at him. The man who had tried to get through the door, the man the room had categorized and dismissed, the man whose worth Davis had demonstrated with a dropped bill on marble. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded. Once. Deliberate. The full weight of something that couldn't be said simply carried in that single movement. Stephen nodded back. That was everything. It was enough. Terry Noon was brought up from the basement, metal frame glasses, brown-soled shoes, the expression of a man already calculating distances between himself and what was coming. Raymond was last. An officer crossed the lobby to the reception desk with the unhurried walk of someone who has done this many times and knows there is no rush. Raymond watched him come. He stood straight, hands flat on the desk, maintaining the posture of a man who still has some dignity to protect, which was perhaps the only currency he had left. The officer read the charges quietly. Conspiracy to obstruct, facilitation of unlawful confinement, accessory to financial fraud. Raymond didn't resist. He looked at Stephen once as they turned him from the desk. A look that lasted less than a second. No legible emotion in it. Nothing that could be called regret or anger or anything else that required acknowledgement. And then he looked at the floor and walked. The room was completely still. The people who had laughed, the ones who had watched Davis drop money at Stephen's feet and found it entertaining, the ones who had let that moment exist by simply not choosing to interrupt it, stood in the particular silence of people who are revising the story of the evening they thought they had been having. The man who had laughed loudest was looking at his shoes. The silence held. No one spoke into it. No one needed to. Chloe walked across the lobby floor, unhurried, straight, no hesitation in her step, and took her father's hand. She didn't look at the people around them. She didn't look at the floor. She looked straight ahead, into the middle of the room, into the quiet aftermath of a night that had spent several hours trying to reduce her father to a specific small thing, and had found that it could not. Stephen looked down at her. She looked up at him. And she smiled, the uncomplicated, whole-face smile of a child who has just confirmed something she believed but wasn't completely sure of, and found it exactly true. 20 minutes later, the room behind them was still being processed. Statements, perimeters, the slow, formal machinery of consequence doing its necessary work. Celine found them on the front steps. Stephen was sitting on the third step from the bottom. Chloe beside him, shoulders touching, a fourth crane taking shape in her hands. The last page of her book, she'd told him, so this one had to count. Celine sat on his other side. None of them spoke for a moment. The traffic on Meridian continued regardless. A cab, a night bus, 2 men outside a bar across the street disagreeing pleasantly about something. The city going, on the way cities go on, indifferent to the specific weight of specific evenings, holding everything and remembering nothing. "Why did you share the information with me?" Celine said. "Before you knew who I was." It wasn't suspicion. It was genuine bewilderment. The question of someone who has spent years working with people whose every action can be mapped to a calculation, trying to locate the calculation in this one. Stephen watched the street for a moment. "Because it didn't matter who you were," he said. "It mattered what you were trying to do." Celine was quiet. Not the quiet of someone with nothing to say. The quiet of someone who has been handed something and is deciding how to hold it. She had worked with trained professionals her entire career. People who knew the stakes before they acted, people whose help came with a complete understanding of the probable outcomes. She was not accustomed to people who helped before the outcome was clear. Who helped because the thing in front of them required it, and that was simply enough. She sat with that for a while. Chloe looked up from her crane. She studied Celine with the frank, appraising look of a child who has not yet learned that this is considered rude. "Are you hungry?" she asked. "Daddy always says you should eat when something scary is over." Celine looked at Stephen. He lifted one shoulder. Small, unhurried. The first movement all night that wasn't about managing something. One side of his mouth moved. "I could eat," Celine said. There was a diner 4 minutes from the hotel. The kind that had been there long enough to stop trying to be anything other than what it was. Laminated menus, a rotating pie display in a glass case, booths with benches worn down to the shape of 10,000 ordinary evenings. It didn't know what it was holding tonight. It held everything the same way. They took the corner booth. Chloe placed the fourth crane at the center of the table, between the sugar dispenser and the laminated specials card. She straightened it once with 2 careful fingers, then left it alone. Celine looked at it. "What does the crane mean?" Chloe was already reading the menu, the way she read everything, completely, without looking up, fully present in whatever she was doing. "It means the person you give it to is safe," she said. Celine picked it up, turned it over in her hand, the precise folds, the careful architecture, the fact that the paper had once been a page of a story and was now something that meant something else entirely, something that had no words for its meaning but didn't need them. She set it down in front of her and left her hand beside it. She didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything to add. Stephen looked at his daughter, the tilt of her head as she read, the slight movement of her lips, the absolute absorption of a child who has already processed everything the night required of her and moved on, completely and without hesitation, to the question of whether to get pancakes. No clenched hands, no bent neck, no small body trying to make itself smaller. Just Chloe, sitting in a diner booth at nearly midnight, choosing between pancakes and waffles, with the full seriousness the decision deserved. He reached into his breast pocket. The 2 cranes from the beginning of the evening, still there, slightly warm, slightly creased from hours against his chest. He set them on the table beside the 4th. 3 cranes. The waitress came. Chloe ordered pancakes without looking up from the menu. Precisely. No hesitation, the way she did everything. And Stephen noticed, in the way you notice things that have been true for a long time but that you've only just seen clearly, that she sounded exactly like him. He looked at the 3 cranes in a row on the table. "As long as the crane stays safe," she had said. "You stay safe, Daddy." He was still here. She was still here. Across the table, a woman he had known for 4 hours was holding a paper bird, and the word safe sat between all 3 of them like something that had been earned. Outside, Meridian Street went on being itself. A bus, a light changing, 2 people meeting on a corner and stopping to talk. The ordinary, continuous indifferent life of a city that doesn't know and doesn't need to know what any particular evening held. Stephen took a slow breath. Let it go. Enough, he thought. This is enough. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is simply not become what the room wants them to be. Stephen never raised his voice, never begged for respect, never explained himself to people who had already decided what he was worth. He just kept being, quietly, completely, the man his daughter already knew him to be. And Chloe, she spent one night watching her father get humiliated by people with money and titles and the comfortable cruelty that comes with both. She felt something she couldn't name, that awful, fleeting shame of wishing, just for a second, that he were different. Then she watched him stand. Not for the crowd, not for recognition, for the woman whose hands were clasped too tightly. For the door, nobody else was watching. For the simple reason that it was the right thing, and he was the person standing there. That's the thing about dignity. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It just keeps showing up. In the corners of rooms. In the fold of a paper crane. In a father who taught his daughter that noticing things other people don't is its own kind of strength. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room. You just have to be the truest. If something in this story stayed with you, a line, a moment, a feeling you recognized but couldn't quite name before, drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and sometimes your words become the reason the next story gets made. Like if Stephen earned it. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one drops. Thank you for watching all the way to the cranes.